She smiled and whispered, "Don't be shy. I don't tell on good boys." And just like that, my world tilted. The first time I saw her, it felt like the ordinary world had paused for a fraction of a second. I was sitting at my usual corner table in the small, sunlit cafe, the one with the slightly creaking wooden chairs and the faint smell of freshly ground coffee beans lingering in the air. My gaze was half on my notebook, half wandering, when she walked in. She moved with a calm confidence that made everything else blur. Her hair, the color of warm chestnut with streaks of gold where the sun hit, framed her face in effortless waves. I noticed the subtle sparkle of her earrings catching the morning light and the soft sway of her scarf as it danced lightly around her neck. There was a grace in her steps, a quiet elegance that drew attention without demanding it. And somehow, she looked directly at me as she passed my table, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. I froze for a moment, feeling both magnetic pull and hesitation. I wanted to say something, anything, but my words felt trapped behind the wall of my own self-consciousness. She had this aura of life experience, a maturity that made me both curious and cautious. I was 26, still learning how to navigate adult interactions with subtlety, and here she was, confident, poised, yet approachable in a way that invited conversation. She ordered her coffee with a calm, measured tone, and I watched the way her hands moved, elegant and deliberate. When she reached for the sugar, our fingers brushed lightly over the small ceramic bowl. That tiny contact sent a surprising warmth up my arm, a pulse that left me aware of every detail: the smooth surface of her hand, the faint scent of her perfume, something floral and comforting that lingered in the air long after she moved away. Her presence was magnetic but not overwhelming. There was no rush, no pressure, just the quiet pull of curiosity. I noticed how she glanced at the books stacked on a nearby shelf, pausing to run her fingers along their spines as if savoring the texture. She moved back to the counter to pay, and her eyes flicked toward mine again, lingering just long enough to make me feel like she saw me, really saw me. When she left, the bell above the door chimed, and the cafe felt suddenly quieter, emptier. I realized I had been holding my breath, and only then did I exhale, my heart still caught somewhere between admiration and hesitation. I wanted to know her, to speak, to bridge the distance, but a part of me held back: the awareness of the age difference, the fear of misreading signals, the simple nervousness that comes with an unexpected spark. Yet even as I returned to my notebook, my pen moving slowly across the page, her image lingered in my mind. The way she had moved, smiled, and carried herself played on repeat, a quiet invitation wrapped in subtlety. It was the kind of encounter that promised more than words could convey, a moment suspended between curiosity and desire, between hesitation and possibility. And I knew, somewhere deep down, that this was just the beginning. A few days after that fleeting encounter, I found myself back at the same cafe, nervously hoping she might be there again. And as if the universe had conspired in my favor, she was, sitting by the window, the morning light spilling over her features like a gentle halo. I hesitated at the entrance, my chest tightening, but there was something in the way she looked up and smiled that nudged me forward. "Don't be shy. I don't tell on good boys," she said with a teasing lilt the moment I approached. The words made my heart stumble in a way I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't flirtation in the obvious sense. It was subtle, warm, and oddly comforting. Her voice carried a calm authority, yet underneath, there was a playful vulnerability that made it impossible not to respond. I laughed, my nerves easing slightly. "I guess that makes me one of the good ones, then?" She tilted her head, the soft sunlight catching the edges of her hair, and smiled, a faint dimple forming at the corner of her cheek. "Depends on how you behave," she replied, eyes sparkling with mischief. Her gaze lingered just a little too long, and I could feel the subtle pull of connection stretching between us, unspoken but palpable. As we talked, I noticed the little details that made her feel so alive. The way she leaned slightly forward when interested, resting her elbow on the table and her chin lightly in her hand. The small gestures, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, adjusting her sleeve, sipping her coffee in a slow, deliberate rhythm, all of it drew me in, made me aware of every subtle movement. It was intimate in the quietest sense, a dance of presence rather than proximity. She listened carefully when I spoke, nodding gently, eyes never leaving mine. Her attention made me braver, coaxed words from me I hadn't meant to share. I told her about my favorite books, the little ambitions I kept to myself, and she responded with stories of her own, travels, experiences, small adventures that hinted at a life fully lived. She laughed softly at my nervous jokes, and when she did, there was a warmth that settled in my chest, a sense of ease I hadn't realized I'd been craving. Our hands brushed lightly when passing the sugar, or when reaching for our drinks at the same time. Each touch was fleeting but electric, a spark of human connection that lingered far longer than it should have. Even in that busy cafe, it felt like we had carved a tiny, private world of our own, one punctuated by soft glances, shared laughter, and the silent thrill of discovery. By the time I left, I was walking on air, my mind replaying her teasing line again and again. "Don't be shy. I don't tell on good boys." It wasn't just a phrase. It was an invitation, a gentle permission to step closer without fear, and the echo of it followed me long after she disappeared from view. That single conversation had shifted something inside me. The curiosity of our first encounter had blossomed into a quiet, eager anticipation for the next one. A week later we met again, this time at the park near the river. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and damp earth, and the sun filtered through the branches in golden shards that danced across the pathway. She was already there, seated on a bench, a book in her lap, her posture relaxed yet elegant. When I approached, she looked up, her eyes lighting with recognition, and gave me that same warm, teasing smile. "Don't be shy," she said softly, echoing her earlier words. "I promise I won't tell." It felt like an invitation, an opening, and I realized I wanted more than small talk this time. We started walking along the winding path, the city's distant hum fading behind the rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. The conversation soon shifted from casual chatter to something deeper: life, regrets, and the quiet dreams we often hide even from ourselves. She told me about the choices she'd made, the moments that had shaped her, her voice carrying both strength and a subtle vulnerability. Her hands, as she spoke, moved in gentle gestures, one hand brushing the edge of her sleeve, the other tapping lightly against her book. There was honesty in the rhythm of her movements, a sincerity that made it impossible to look away. When it was my turn, I hesitated, but her steady gaze encouraged me. I spoke of fears I rarely voiced aloud, of ambitions that felt too fragile to share with anyone else. I felt the tension in my chest ease as she nodded, listening without judgment, her presence comforting like the steady warmth of sunlight. At one point, as I recounted a particularly embarrassing memory, she reached out and lightly touched my arm. The gesture was brief, almost incidental, but it carried a quiet reassurance that sent a shiver through me, a reminder that connection isn't always loud, and sometimes, it is the subtle touches that linger the longest. We paused on a small wooden bridge that arched over the river. The water reflected the sky, rippling gently, and for a moment, the world seemed suspended between past regrets and future possibilities. She rested her hand on the railing close to mine, and I noticed the warmth of her fingers against the cool wood, the ease with which we shared this space without words. It was intimate, yes, but not in a rushed or urgent way. It was the slow unfolding of trust. By the time we sat back down on the bench, the conversation had shifted into comfortable silence. I was aware of her subtle presence beside me, the light scent of her perfume mingling with the crisp air, the soft rise and fall of her breathing, the occasional brush of her hair against my shoulder as she adjusted her posture. In that quiet, I felt a deep, unspoken connection forming, a bridge between curiosity and genuine understanding. As we parted that afternoon, the anticipation of seeing her again weighed sweetly on me. That walk, those moments of honesty, had transformed the spark of initial attraction into something more profound. Something rooted in mutual respect, emotional depth, and the quiet thrill of knowing that vulnerability shared is the foundation of intimacy. The days after our walk by the river were filled with an ache I couldn't quite name. Every message, Every casual text from her carried an undercurrent of warmth that both thrilled and terrified me. I wanted to dive in, to lean into this connection, but a quiet voice of hesitation lingered at the edge of my thoughts. The age difference, though never mentioned aloud, hovered like an unspoken barrier. I worried about how it might look to others, whether I was overstepping boundaries, whether I was reading more into her attention than was actually there. It didn't help that friends had noticed the spark too. One evening, over beers, a friend joked, lightly, but with a pointed glance, "You're hanging out with someone older, careful, man." The words weren't malicious, but they stung. I laughed, deflected the comment, but inside, the seed of doubt had been planted. What if I was wrong? What if my feelings, my hope, were just youthful imagination, mistaking kindness and playfulness for something more? And yet, when I saw her, all caution melted away. That first morning when she appeared at the cafe, sunlight catching the soft strands of her hair, her eyes holding that familiar, teasing warmth, the tension in my chest eased, only to return later, quietly gnawing at my conscience. I found myself analyzing every smile, every glance, replaying our moments together, and questioning what they truly meant. It wasn't just external opinions that caused hesitation. It was also the intimacy of what we had already shared. Our conversations, the brief touches, the lingering silences, they had opened doors I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. The thought of being vulnerable with someone so assured, so gracefully experienced, made my heart race and my stomach tighten. I wanted to reach out, to lean in closer, but I was afraid of misreading signals, afraid of risking the delicate balance we had found. One afternoon, as we walked through the city park, I noticed the subtle ways she expressed concern when I hesitated, a hand brushing lightly against my elbow, a soft glance that seemed to say, "It's okay, I understand." Her gestures were gentle, not forcing, but they highlighted the tension I felt even more sharply. Each small movement reminded me of the quiet emotional pull between us, and the fact that I wanted it as much as I feared it. By evening, as I sat alone with my thoughts, I realized hesitation had become its own presence, a quiet, almost tangible weight. The world felt fuller when she was near, yet emptier when she wasn't. My emotions were in conflict, desire, admiration, fear, and respect all intertwining in a complicated, restless pattern. And then I remembered her words from our first conversation, whispered in that playful, yet knowing tone. "Don't be shy. I don't tell on good boys." It wasn't a command, not exactly, but a gentle invitation, one that encouraged me to move past hesitation, to step closer to what I truly felt. It gave me the courage to consider taking a risk, not recklessly, but with honesty, with awareness, and with the hope that perhaps our connection was strong enough to withstand the doubts and judgments outside our little shared world. The first time I let myself really step closer to her, it wasn't dramatic. There were no grand declarations or cinematic gestures, just a quiet moment, suspended in the soft hum of the world around us. We were sitting at a small bench in a quiet corner of the park, late afternoon light spilling through the trees in warm, golden streaks. The air was fragrant with the faint smell of jasmine from nearby gardens, mingling with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. It felt intimate, almost private, despite the subtle bustle of the city beyond. We had been talking, as we often did, about small things, favorite books, memories from childhood, little regrets, but there was a pause, a quiet moment of mutual presence, when words felt insufficient. I noticed her hands resting lightly on her lap, fingers occasionally brushing against each other as though she, too, was aware of the unspoken tension in the air. My own hands felt heavy, hesitant, caught somewhere between desire and fear. Finally, gathering courage, I reached for her hand. It was a gentle, tentative gesture at first, my fingers brushing the back of hers, a delicate connection rather than an assertive grasp. Her reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Her eyes softened, her lips curved into a small, approving smile, and she leaned in just slightly. That tiny movement sent warmth radiating up my arm, a steady, grounding pulse that seemed to say, "This is right." The moment stretched, elastic in its simplicity. I let my palm rest lightly against hers, feeling the faint heat of her skin, the gentle rise and fall of her heartbeat as she shifted in her seat. It was almost as if the world had narrowed to just the two of us, the outside noise fading to a gentle blur. I felt her relax, the tension in her shoulders easing, and for the first time, I allowed myself to simply exist in her presence without the shadow of hesitation. Her hair, soft and slightly sun-warmed, brushed against my wrist when she adjusted her position. I became acutely aware of the subtle details I had always noticed but now felt with heightened intensity: the warmth of her palm, the delicate scent she carried, the softness of her voice when she murmured something casual that made my pulse quicken. It was intimate in a way that words couldn't capture, a shared understanding conveyed through mere touch and quiet attention. She didn't pull away. She didn't rush or withdraw. Instead, she rested her hand against mine with quiet assurance, allowing the connection to deepen naturally. In that brief contact, all the doubts I had wrestled with, the age difference, the fear of misreading signals, the weight of external opinions, seemed to fade. There was only this moment, only this exchange of trust and courage, and it was enough to make everything else seem distant and irrelevant. When she finally spoke, it was softly, almost conspiratorially. "I'm glad you didn't hesitate," she said, her eyes holding mine. There was no pressure, no judgment, just warmth and acceptance. And in that simple affirmation, I realized that this was the turning point, the bridge between curiosity and closeness, between hesitation and emotional honesty. The first tender touch had broken the barrier, and in its wake, a slow, steady flame of connection began to grow. After that first tender touch in the park, the distance between us felt smaller, almost imperceptible. It wasn't about rushing or labeling anything. It was about being present with each other in a way that had never happened before. One late afternoon, we met at her apartment, a cozy, sun-drenched space filled with soft textures, books stacked in casual towers, and the faint aroma of fresh tea steeping on the counter. There was something grounding about the environment, an intimacy that made it easier for walls to fall away. We settled into the worn leather couch, sitting close enough that our shoulders brushed. The air was warm, and the soft hum of a ceiling fan created a quiet rhythm, almost like a heartbeat between us. For the first time, I noticed the subtle ways she communicated her feelings beyond words, the way her foot lightly touched mine when we shifted positions, the gentle tilt of her head as she listened, the soft warmth radiating from her hands resting just nearby. Our conversation turned naturally toward deeper topics, the kind of talks that leave you both exhilarated and a little vulnerable. She shared stories of past heartbreaks, moments where life had tested her patience, her resilience, and even her optimism. Her voice was calm, measured, but there was a fragility beneath it, a hint that she trusted me enough to reveal the parts of herself she often kept hidden. I responded in kind, telling her about moments of doubt in my own life, insecurities I rarely voiced aloud. As I spoke, I could feel the tension in my chest easing, replaced by a quiet sense of understanding, a mutual recognition that we were choosing to be seen, truly seen, by each other. At one point, without thinking, I reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she intertwined her fingers with mine, the gesture small but significant. I became acutely aware of every detail: the warmth of her palm, the subtle pressure of her grip, the way our hands fit together naturally. I felt the steady rhythm of her heartbeat through the slight contact, and a deep sense of connection settled over me, grounding me in the present. We didn't need to speak constantly. Silence became comfortable, a shared space that carried more meaning than words ever could. I felt her rest her head lightly on my shoulder for a brief moment, the softness of her hair brushing against my cheek. The gentle weight was reassuring, a quiet affirmation of trust, and I realized that our bond was no longer just about attraction or curiosity. It had transformed into something deeper, a partnership built on honesty, empathy, and mutual respect. By the time I left that evening, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in warm shades of orange and pink. Walking back to my apartment, I replayed every glance, every brush of skin, every shared laugh and sigh. I knew this connection was real, something worth nurturing despite the external whispers or internal doubts that had once held me back. For the first time, I felt certain that the slow, deliberate steps we were taking together were leading to something enduring, a quiet, steady love that was as much about emotional intimacy as it was about presence and care. Weeks had passed since that afternoon on her couch, and our connection had grown into something steady, comforting, and quietly thrilling. There was no rush to define what we were, no need to force words onto feelings that had already been expressed through glances, gentle touches, and shared silences. One early evening, we found ourselves walking along the riverbank again, the sky painted in soft hues of lavender and gold, the water reflecting the fading light like a ribbon of molten glass. We walked side by side, our steps almost perfectly in sync. Every now and then, her hand would brush mine, lingering just long enough to make me aware of the warmth and reassurance it carried. At one point I reached for her hand fully, intertwining our fingers. She didn't hesitate. The gesture was simple, almost ordinary, but it carried all the unspoken promises, all the emotional intimacy we had built together. Her hand was warm in mine, steady, and the contact radiated a quiet affirmation that we were moving forward together, fully present in the moment. We paused on a small, wooden pier that jutted slightly over the water. The wind was gentle, carrying the faint scent of the river and the soft fragrance she always seemed to bring with her. I looked at her, noticing again the subtle elegance that had captivated me from the beginning, the way her hair caught the light, the softness of her smile, the quiet depth in her eyes. She met my gaze, and for a long moment, we simply looked at each other, words unnecessary. Everything we had felt, everything we had shared, was reflected in that silence. "I'm glad we found this, us," she said softly, her voice carrying the warmth of the sun and the sincerity of someone who had waited patiently for the right moment. My chest tightened in a familiar, pleasant way, and I felt the urge to pull her closer, not in urgency, but in the need to communicate how much she meant to me without speaking. She leaned slightly into me, resting her head lightly against my shoulder. The weight was gentle, almost imperceptible, yet grounding. I could feel her heartbeat in sync with the rhythm of the evening, the steady warmth of her body a reminder that we had both chosen trust over hesitation, intimacy over distance. We stayed like that for a while, hands entwined, eyes occasionally wandering over the soft ripples of the water, letting the world fade around us. When we finally stood to leave, there was no rush. We walked back slowly, fingers still intertwined, sharing quiet laughter and small, private jokes. Every brush of her hand, every glance, felt like a reaffirmation of what we had built, a connection that was patient, respectful, and deeply cherished. By the time the streetlights flickered on, casting soft pools of light along the pathway, I realized that the journey we had taken, from hesitant glances, playful banter, and emotional vulnerability to this quiet closeness, had been worth every moment. There were no dramatic gestures, no sudden confessions, only the steady, comforting truth that sometimes love grows best when it is slow, tender, and fully present. As we parted that night, she pressed a soft kiss to my cheek, a gesture so simple yet filled with warmth and certainty. I walked home with a lightness in my chest, knowing that the slow-burning connection we had nurtured would continue to deepen, a relationship grounded in trust, respect, and quiet, enduring affection.